Hey everybody, I'm Jack Rita. I'm a designer with Future Pastimes, and I work on expansions for the 2019 edition of the classic Dune board game, published by Gale Force 9. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the design process and how it relates to leveraging material from the extended Dune universe books, and a little bit about the timeline of the board game in terms of which characters are going to show up there. Um, when we've put out expansions for this edition of Dune, people will recognize right away that a lot of the characters are drawn from the extended Dune universe books. And those are the books that are written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. And those books can be very divisive in the Dune fan community. There are certainly a number of people who they love those books because it's an opportunity to get more Dune. It's related to Frank's material. It's derived, presumably, from a lot of the notes, but I'm sure that liberties have been taken and new material has been created from whole cloth, but it is still based on the Dune universe. It has a clear connection to it. But there are definitely people out there who cannot stand the books. They don't like it. They won't read any more of them. They've been burned, whatever the case may be. And so they are very critical of us using material from those books. But I would like to defend that, if I can, in this video. Talk about the whys and wherefores of that process. For me, I remember the first time I read some of the Brian and Kevin books, and I was definitely disappointed. And that was because I was not only expecting Dune material and Dune story, but I was expecting it to be written in the style of Frank Herbert. And it's definitely not. Frank Herbert is a singular author in terms of how he writes. His prose is very philosophical, and it's really hard to emulate that. And I think that Brian and Kevin made a very conscious decision to not even try. They're like, look, we can't write like Frank Herbert, so we're not going to. But what we want to do is we want to play in that sandbox of the Dune universe. And we want to build on some of the stuff that's in there. So like a lot of things like Riches and Grumman and Ix and Tleilax and Planet Ekaz and Tupile and all these things, they're all mentioned in Dune. They're all things that Frank created. They appear, if nowhere else, in the glossary of that first novel, and in some of the subsequent novels, they are built on a little bit, like the Tleilax, who become a major player in the subsequent novels, the Ixians to a lesser degree as well, and so a lot of that has a clear basis, which the extended novels have built on. So they've definitely, Brian and Kevin definitely made up characters that are not mentioned necessarily in any of Frank's books. But again, there's a clear connection in there. And we felt that it was useful to be able to leverage those details, because that's what makes the play of the game a lot more interesting. We just didn't have an interest in having a faction where it was X representative 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and not really be able to use character names. For me, I hate the fact that there is a guild representative in the guild faction. And furthermore, it's always bugged me that that's really the only leader in the guild faction that's directly connected to the guild. But you know, that is what it is. We're not going to reinvent the guild faction. But when we were looking for making new factions, we wanted to be able to insert real characters in there. When we were developing the Chom and Riches expansion, we started off by just scouring all of the books for anybody with a name who was directly connected to Chom. And for the longest time, there just was nobody. There was always just these nameless, faceless characters, Chom Auditor and Chom Merchant and Chom Director and Chom, but, you know, they had no personality. And we were finally resigned to that when the new trilogy the Duke of Caladan trilogy came out, that suddenly CHOAM had identities. There was an director, and there was a president of CHOAM, and there were other characters who had a clear connection to CHOAM, and CHOAM had its own agenda and subplot. And we were like, we have to definitely take advantage of this. So we revisited all of the designs, we reworked it, and we added some more specific flavor to that faction based on those books. So it really, I thought, brought the faction to life in a way that we were not really going to be able to do as well before that book had come out. And for me, like, I'm kind of lukewarm on that trilogy. There's stuff about it I like, and some about it I was like, it was all right. But the CHOAM stuff I thought was really interesting, and that subplot through those 3 books kept my interest, and I was really glad that we had leveraged those characters. In terms of the timeline, the events for the Dune board game are in and around the time of that novel. So Duke Leto is dead. Paul is in charge of the House Atreides, but it's kind of, it's a little bit fuzzy because, Duncan Idaho's alive and not a Gola. So it's kind of a little bit of a fuzzy, but in some ways a fairly strict timeline that the original designers have imposed on themselves. They were not interested in bringing in any characters from Dune Messiah or later. So that is why we don't have Scytale as part of the Tleilaxu faction. But the House Trilogy books, House Atreides, House Harkonnen, and House Carino, which takes place in the couple of decades leading up to Dune, there were a lot of characters that were associated with the Tleilaxu in those books, as well as characters associated with Ix. And we felt, there's a reasonable, if you're playing What If in terms of conquering Arrakis in a game, that those characters could have been around if they had played their cards right around that same timeline. So that was kind of what the reasoning was behind those decisions. And in terms of taking advantage of the extended novel books, we're not the only one. So if you look at Dune Imperium, which takes place around the same time as our Dune games, you're talking about, they've got characters like Count Ilban Riches, and that is a character that was created by Brian and Kevin. House Riches was created by Frank, but he didn't really go into any detail about those characters. And so you get characters like that, and a character like Archduke Armand Ikaz is a character from the extended novels who is in Dune Imperium. So they realized the benefit of leveraging those things, and that is so that you can insert details into the game, and that's really what helps bring a game to life. And that's really what we were after for the stuff that we've brought into the game. So the storyline with House Riches, where they had, it was already well known that they were makers of technology, that they competed with the Ixians, but beyond that, there wasn't that much detail from Frank to draw upon. But there's a subplot in the House Trilogy book about why Riches is not a tech dominant faction like the Ixians, and also that subplot had a really interesting element with the no fields. And so we were like, this is a great thing to bring into the game. So those no field tokens from the CHOAM and Riches expansion, I think, are one of the neatest things that we put in there. And then there's just the idea of them selling off their technology, we thought was an interesting take for a faction to play in the game. And it allowed us to insert some interesting new treachery cards without bloating the treachery deck even more. We certainly bloated it a little bit, but I think I'm all right with that, especially because I play a lot of 6-player. I also play 7 and 8 player, and so having a larger treachery deck, I think, makes more sense for that sort of thing. And that's kind of the direction that I'm going in with my gaming. But the other thing with the additional treachery cards is that, again, it adds more flavor, variety, and theme to the game. So that's just some thoughts. How we felt about leveraging the Brian stuff. It was mutually beneficial, I think. So we like having those extra details in there, and those stories have grown on me. I don't really enjoy the Butlerian Jihad trilogy that much. I couldn't get into that one so much. It was very space opera, and I can probably revisit it, enjoy it more. Again, knowing if I'm managing my expectations, I can probably get a lot more out of it. But some of the other ones, like the House trilogy, I actually did enjoy those. Again, once I was able to say, all right, this is not Frank's writing. It's taking place in this universe, and I can get a lot more out of it. So there's some interesting storylines in there. I think it's worth looking at, and there's some great details in there. We're going to have the Sisterhood of Dune show on HBO, and that's going to be drawn from none of Frank's work. It's probably based largely on the Bene Gesserit School book that was written by Brian and Kevin, but it's going to have new writers in there. So I look forward to seeing what new authors are able to do in the Dune universe and playing in that sandbox. And I look forward to whatever kind of game comes out of that as well. So that's it for this one. Let me know your thoughts on there. Have you had a come to Shai-Hulud moment with the Brian and Kevin books? Have you just decided there's no way that you're ever going to give them a chance? Let me know why in the comments. Again, you don't necessarily have to go read those books in order to enjoy these factions in the game. The first time I played Dune, I hadn't ever read the book, and I loved the game. It made me want to read the book, and I was glad I did. And I have had to reread Dune many, many, many times, partly because I just like to read it, but a lot has to do with working on the Dune game. I have to reacquaint myself with that book and others time and time again. And I find that the original Dune book is like an onion. Every time I revisit it, there's another layer down. I get more out of it. I understand it more. I get more insights. And that's just the magic of Frank Herbert's writing. It's great. But for a good, cheap pulp story, the Brian and Kevin books are not that bad. So go ahead, check them out. Again, I recommend start off with House Atreides, Harkonnen, and Carino trilogy. It's a little bit melodramatic. That would be, I think, a fair assessment of their writing style. But again, there's some really great details, and there's some interesting plot lines in there. A lot of the subplots, I think, are the best parts of those books. And that's the stuff that we're leveraging the most for these Dune expansions. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.